So Canelo and Charlo has an undercard, or at least BoxingScene.com, very credible website, is telling us we have an undercard. If you stick around, you can find out what the undercard is. And I'd like to welcome you right now. If this is your first time at the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It sure helps Uncle Lukie out so I can try to get really credible guests. I can talk down to promoters. I can do a bunch of stuff that we've always dreamed. Go to PR guys that hate me and be like, I know you hate me, but now you have to let your fighter do interviews with me because I have so many views, and views are the golden ticket to everything in boxing. So if you think I'm cool, do that so I can do that. Let's watch the groovy intro and discuss this pay-per-view undercard. So Jake Donovan and Keith Idec kind of blasted off and put Boxing Scene on the map once again with stellar reporting. The undercard for Canelo Alvarez versus Jermell Charlo, a very interesting bout that we'll see Jermell Charlo moving up from 154 pounds to 168 pounds. They're both undisputed champions. What a mouthful. But when the bell rings, Jermell Charlo will be stripped of his WBO 154-pound title because that's what the WBO is saying. So the minute the bell rings, he will no longer be the champion. So he will be undisputed until the first bell rings, and then there will be a dispute because Tim Tszyu will become the WBO champion the minute the fight happens on September 30th. So, what are the bouts on the undercard? Well, it looks like the co-feature will be Yordenis Ugas versus Mario Barrios. Yordenis Ugas, former WBA welterweight champion, taking on Mario Barrios, who holds, I believe, the WBA secondary form of the belt at 140 pounds. Lost the title to Tank, and then I think the belt kind of just disappeared. I can't really remember what's happened to the belt, but it is a secondary championship, and when Mario Barrios won that, though he was a world champion and distinguished as one, Josh Taylor was the man in that era. Josh Taylor held the WBA belt that I think people hold to a higher esteem, and he was an undisputed champion for a time period before I think injuries have caught up to Taylor, and now we're kind of seeing the very end of Taylor's run. So, Yordenis Ugas, Mario Barrios. This fight screams who has more left. Because Ugas had a bad face injury after fighting Canelo Alvarez. It really looked bad. Fight got stopped, loses his belt. He hasn't fought since. And Mario Barrios won the fights he needed to, but then now he's 0-2 in pay-per-view headlining fights. He somehow fought Keith Thurman on pay-per-view, which that is going to age really strange. That's a absolutely great fight, but I don't think that's a pay-per-view fight. That's just guys are getting paid a lot, and we got to make it make sense by putting it on pay-per-view. But the Gervonta Davis versus Mario Barrios fight was a stellar fight, and he was in that fight up until he wasn't in that fight. So to me, this is going to be who is the guy that's going to stay at the highest level of the sport. Ugas a little older. Barrios has lost to two really credible names in the sport. Barrios has competed, I want to say, all the way down to 126 pounds. Now he's at welterweight. Ugas has danced between 140 to 147 off the top of my head. This is who's going to get one more chance at a big opportunity. The other guy is going to probably fall into a position where you're going to be looking to challenge guys like Cody Crowley or Boots Ennis as a big name, but in an inopportune situation over the next coming years, unless those guys lap them. Another fight on the card, Jake Donovan reported this one, was Jesus Ramos Jr. versus Erickson Lubin. This is kind of a crossroads fight for both guys, but in different senses. Lubin has lost two different fights where they should have been big opportunities to get his career going. Going into the 2016 Olympics, there was a belief that Erickson Lubin was the best amateur boxer in the country, yet Lubin couldn't kind of live up to that potential at that time because he turned pro. He turned pro for Iron Mike Promotions and then kind of found himself on these PVC platforms, but gets knocked out in one round to Jermell Charlo. That kind of starts the Jermell Charlo saga. Now Charlo, from that first round knockout, probably about 5-6 years later, now Jermell Charlo is a pay-per-view main eventer. Lubin's fighting on the undercard. That's how paths differ. So that's his first knockout. Then he goes and he fights Fundora, back and forth fight, but Fundora outlasts him and stops him. There's durability questions with Lubin. He looked good against Luis Aries. He's wanted the big fights. Ramos is a guy that I awarded Prospect of the Year 2021. I don't see how people didn't give him the award, but once again, I just don't think people really watch boxing outside of the main events. So Jesus Ramos Jr., very good fighter. He beat two really good fighters that year, one of which being Brian Mendoza, who went on to be a world champion after that fight. So that's going to be a fight where this is Ramos going to be what I believe he is, one of the 2 or 3 best guys at 154 pounds, or can Lubin live up to the potential? I think my gut feeling right now says this is where Ramos kind of introduces himself to the world and then kind of becomes this generation's Leo Santa Cruz for the PBC, becomes a Mexican-American headliner for whatever platforms they're going to do as they look to put on big fights. That's what I see this fight doing, but is it possible Lubin wins the fight? Of course, I think Lubin could win the fight, and it's a very interesting fight that I'm excited to see where the odds makers set the fight at, because I think that you have to favor Jesus Ramos. It's like a 70-30 fight, but Lubin's very live in this fight. And then what probably will open the card will be Elijah Garcia versus Jose Resendiz. Resendiz, kind of a limited come-forward guy, really reminds me of Vidal, the guy that Sampson had that Elijah Garcia picked apart. Elijah didn't look the greatest on the Tank Ryan undercard. That being said, Elijah Garcia is a fighter at the middleweight division where I think TGB Promotions, as well as myself, have very high hopes for him. So this style, in theory, should be a very good matchup for Elijah Garcia to display what I think he does the best, which is dictate range and catch an aggressive guy who's maybe limited with his offensive creativity, closing the gap at dominating and possibly looking spectacular. So I think that what you're going to see is probably Elijah Garcia and Jesus Ramos Jr. stand out against credible world-class opposition and introduce themselves as, we are going to be the guys that PBC builds around in 2024 and 2025. I think that's the rubric of what we're looking at. Resendiz has earned this shot, and Lubin by far has earned this shot. But I think that those two intro fights are going to be there. Also, I'm hearing that Alexander Gvozdyk, who's associated with Canelo Alvarez, is going to be featured on this card. As we all know, light heavyweight is a terrible division. It's a two-man race. It's Beterbiev, Bivol, and then whatever guy we want to rank as number one, and then they more than likely lose to those guys. Gvozdyk is a welcome addition. I know that Beterbiev knocked him out and beat him and overcame being outboxed with his power, but Gvozdyk is a real credible opponent, a real credible name, and if he could get a fight with a guy like Dmitry Bivol, that would be exciting, because it's a shame that Dmitry Bivol hasn't even fought in 2023 after having the most magnificent 2022. It's just a shame that we don't get to see the best fighters actually fight all that often. So those are my thoughts. What do you think of this undercard? Is this undercard good? Am I being far too critical? Do you agree with my thoughts? Am I sweating way too much? Is this gross? Leave some comments. Let me know. Subscribe to the channel. All that good stuff. I'll be back when something interesting happens.